talking about the nature of government today. Now, it is not, nor ever has been, my position that there is no utility for government. There are legitimate purposes for government. However, government has far exceeded its usefulness and vastly far exceeded any legitimate purposes that it may have had, in my opinion. So, people don't understand the nature of government. And I would say that, you probably shouldn't handle wild animals, venomous snakes or such, if you don't understand their nature. And yet, people want government to be a panacea for everything without understanding the nature of it at all. They never consider the nature of government. So, I want to talk about that. First, government is by nature inefficient. This should be obvious. Government is bureaucratic in nature. It's basically a glorified middleman. And being that there's very little accountability in general when it comes to whether stuff gets done on time or properly, or whether funds are utilized appropriately, it's going to inherently be inefficient. It does not do things as well as the private sector does. That's very obvious, abundantly obvious. You can see that everywhere. So we have to consider, if we are going to use government, that it's going to be a very inefficient way to achieve our goals, very inefficient means to our ends. Do we want that? Second, government is inherently parasitic. This is, I would think, obvious, but it may need some explaining to some people, because government cannot produce. It can only redistribute. It doesn't produce anything by itself. Everything that government achieves is through someone else's labor, or reallocating resources, taking resources from someone else, and redistributing them. It can't do anything by itself, so it has to live off of the labor and of the people, the resources of the environment, and the resources of the state, the resources of the real economy. And like a parasite, it tends to keep feeding that and growing for as long as it can. Government does not willingly reduce its size. It does not willingly shrink itself. It sucks the blood and bloats up like a tick till it falls off, till it collapses under its own weight. That's the nature of government. By nature, it is parasitic. Well, by nature, government is also corrupt. Government is run by people. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. If people are given a lot of power, there is going to be corruption. So far, our government isn't run by AI, so our government is inherently corrupt. All governments are inherently corrupt. To different levels, no, sure. Some are definitely worse than others, but there's always going to be corruption. And that should be obvious. It's not just government, it's in corporate structures as well. It's in human nature. But governments are made up of and run by humans, so governments, therefore, are inherently corrupt. So when we're using the government to achieve our desired ends, we are using something that is inefficient, parasitic, and corrupt. But it gets worse. Government is inherently violent. In order for a government to maintain control over its subjects, it has to have a monopoly on violence. The monopoly on violence is the deciding factor on whether it can remain in power or not. Because if it does not have that monopoly, it's going to be challenged. Its power structure is going to be challenged by organized crime, by revolution, by coups. To maintain the power, the government must have a monopoly on violence. Government is inherently violent. So in order for a government to maintain control over the society, there has to be laws. If the laws mean anything at all, they have to be enforced. To enforce laws, you have to have a monopoly on violence. Now, the problem isn't that there are laws. The problem is not that the laws are enforced. There's no point in having laws if you don't enforce them. The problem isn't that, obviously, it requires violence to enforce laws. The problem is that, theoretically, any law you make that you choose to enforce, no matter how minor, comes with a death penalty. So, for instance, I commit some minor offense and I get a ticket and I don't pay my ticket and I get an appearance ticket to court and I don't show up to court. Eventually I get a warrant. I get pulled over because my tail light's out. They see I got a warrant, so they're going to arrest me. Now here, if I choose not to comply, if I resist with enough violence to actually not be arrested, I can be killed. I mean, I may not be killed, I may get tased and incapacitated, but should I successfully resist arrest with enough violence to make it happen, I will be killed. If not by them, if not by the officer arresting me, then by backup, eventually a SWAT team, whatever. It will escalate to the point where you're shooting somebody over nothing. Now I know the person that didn't comply is an idiot. You probably shouldn't do that. It might not be a terrible thing that they're taking themselves out of the gene pool. That's not the point. The point is, when we make laws, we have to consider the nature of government. We have to consider that government has a monopoly on violence, and that for the law to be meaningful, that monopoly on violence will have to be used. So, and as unlikely as it may be, we do run the risk of killing somebody over trivial laws. So I think whenever we make a law, we should ask ourselves, are we willing to kill somebody over this? Is this that big a deal? Should this be a legal matter? Should this be a matter for the law, a matter for the state to address? If it has to be, if there's not another way, okay. But I think if we look at all the laws we have, we'd say, yeah, maybe this really isn't a matter for the state. Maybe this isn't something that we need to use a monopoly on violence to enforce. Perhaps this is not, under any scenario imaginable, worth killing somebody over. So, do we think about those things when we make laws? No. What our society does, right or left, anything they don't like, they want a law. We should have a minimum amount of laws. What we should be doing is going through our laws and seeing what we can do without, not where can we make more of them. And that's what Congress's purpose is to make laws. That culture needs to change. But it's not going to, because people don't willingly relinquish power, generally speaking. And the state certainly does not. The state as its own entity is not going to willingly give up its power. So when you put all this together, you realize that the nature of government is evil. By nature, government is evil. And as Thomas Paine so eloquently put it, society in every state is a blessing. But government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. And in its worst state, an intolerable one. I agree with all that, except possibly the necessary evil part. But if we examine government and look at what it is at the core, we look at the nature of government, we will find that government is, by nature, inefficient, parasitic, corrupt, violent, and evil. That doesn't mean there's no utility for it. But when you deal with something that is, by nature, inefficient, parasitic, corrupt, violent, and evil, you should ask yourself, is this the best tool for the job? Maybe we should be very careful about how we utilize this tool. Maybe we should keep it to a minimum and not grow it exponentially. That's all.